Hi everyone, thank you very much for listening to this webinar that we've recorded today. We were just going to do this webinar to talk through our Just Transition assessments that we are piloting this year in 2021. You could go to the next slide, please. So just to quickly talk through WBA's Just Transition team. On the left-hand side, we have our decarbonisation and energy team, which is made up of Charlotte, Matt, Aparna and Vicky. And in combination with the social team, which is myself, Sarah, Catherine, Sophia and Dan. You go to the next slide, please. So just the agenda for the webinar today. There are three parts. Part one will talk through our climate and energy benchmarks and how our Just Transition assessments are integrated into our climate and energy benchmark that we are piloting this year. In part two is our Just Transition methodology. So this is the 6 indicators that we have developed this year and that we'll be rolling out the rest of the year and assessing companies on. These are social dialogue and stakeholder engagement, planning for a just transition, green and decent job creation, retaining and or upskilling, social protection, social impact management, and advocacy. And then in part 3, my colleague Charlotte will quickly give an overview of the company engagement process and the results. Next slide, please. So part 1, the climate and energy benchmarks and how the Just Transition assessments form part of the assessment that we are conducting this year. Next slide, please. So just a bit of background on WBA. We are a global organisation that develops free and publicly available benchmarks, and we use these to measure company performance on the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. These benchmarks equip investors, governments, civil society, individuals and companies with all the information that they need to engage and step up on the Sustainable Development Goals. And we do this through collective action, through a strong global alliance of over 220 organisations, and we are funded solely by governments and foundations. On the right-hand side, you'll see our 7 systems transformations diagram. So the 7 systems that you can see are decarbonisation and energy, that we'll be covering today, food and agriculture, circular, which will be changed to nature, digital, urban, the financial system, and then in the centre is the social transformation. So these 7 systems transformations are all needed to achieve the SDGs by 2030, recognising the interconnectedness and interdependent nature of the SDGs. And as you can see, social is in the centre as it underpins all the other systems transformations and is based on the SDGs Leave No One Behind principle. So by 2023, we will have benchmarked 2,000 of the world's most influential companies across all areas of those 7 systems transformations. Next slide, please. So how does the decarbonisation and energy transformation fit within our broader work at WBA? So the decarbonisation and energy transformation is one of the 7 systems transformations, and in it we assess 450 of the world's most influential companies in high emitting sectors, and we do this to deepen the accountability of companies to ensure a decarbonisation and energy transformation that leaves no one behind. So within the transformation, we have our climate and energy benchmarks, and these rank the performance of companies against the transformation that's required to meet the Paris Agreement. And we use the ACT methodology to do this in partnership with CDP and DEM. And then this year, 2021, we have developed our Just Transition assessments. And these are the social component of the decarbonisation and energy transformation. And this social component measures what companies are doing to respect the rights of workers, communities, and the most vulnerable. So overall, our goal is to drive action by companies, investors, policymakers, and stakeholders to encourage businesses to move well below a 2-degree compatible pathway that is just and equitable. Next slide, please. So as you will note from the previous diagram of the 7 systems transformation, the social transformation is the red circle in the middle. And this underpins all the other systems transformations. And we will eventually assess 2000, the SDG 2000, which are the 2000 most influential companies in the world, on these social indicators. So the social transformation framework measures what companies are doing to ensure they leave no one behind. And there are 3 areas that you can see in the center of the circle of responsible business conduct. At the bottom is respect for human rights. So this is assessing companies on their performance on the UNGPs, the UN Guiding Principles. And we look at commitments to human rights, due diligence, and access to remedy. And then on the right-hand side is the provision and promotion of decent work. And here we look at a range of decent work topics, from health and safety to living wage, diversity, gender, and female empowerment. And then finally, on the left is act ethically, where we assess companies on whether they're paying fair taxes, their disclosures around data privacy, the elimination of bribery and corruption, and responsible lobbying and political engagement. So within the 3 pillars, or the 3 areas of responsible business conduct, are 18 indicators. And these 18 indicators make up the framework, the set of core social indicators that will be embedded into all of WBA's benchmarks by 2023. And as I said before, we will assess all 2000 other companies across WBA on the social transformation framework. Next slide, please. So how this all pieces together in terms of the Just Transition assessment that we are doing this year, that falls within the slice, the yellow slice you can see in the diagram, the decarbonisation and energy transformation. So the 3 pieces that I refer to are the ACT assessment in yellow, the core social indicators, which form the red slice at the bottom of the triangle, and then the Just Transition indicators, which is what we've developed this year, are the cross-striped yellow and red section in the middle, the overlay between the decarbonisation and energy parts, the ACT part, and the core social indicators. So this methodology, the Just Transition indicators, were developed in partnership and in consultation with 20 organisations, both within and beyond the Alliance. And as I said, this is a pilot year. So we developed a methodology in the first half of the year, and we are piloting the assessment in the rest of the year, which will result in 180 assessments of 180 companies across the oil and gas, electric utilities, and automotive manufacturing sectors. So this year, the scores for the 3 assessments will be presented separately, but we plan to integrate the assessments, so the 3 parts, into one full climate and energy benchmark ranking next year, so in 2022. And just to go back to the methodology, we developed the Just Transition methodology through extensive stakeholder consultation. So this involved an online technical survey, bilateral calls, and 2 multi-stakeholder consultation roundtables. And we also have our Just Transition Advisory Group, which is a group of around 16 experts on the Just Transition representing different stakeholders who have helped us hone and develop the methodology in the first half of the year. Go to the next slide, please. So part 2 will just go into a little bit more detail into the Just Transition methodology. So the 6 Just Transition indicators that we will assess 180 companies on this year. Next slide, please. So assessing a just transition, these indicators are presented here as sector agnostic fundamentals. So there are a set of cross-cutting fundamental requirements that apply to all companies regardless of the sector. So they are not everything that a company should be doing on a just transition, but as many companies are at the beginning of the journey, along developing approaches to the just transition, there are a set of sort of first steps that a company should be taking towards contributing to a just transition. So the 6 just transition indicators are social dialogue and stakeholder engagement, planning for a just transition, green and decent job creation, retaining and or upskilling, social protection and social impact management, and advocacy for policies and regulations supporting a just transition. And next slide, please. So indicator 1 is fundamentals of social dialogue and stakeholder engagement in a just transition. So each of the indicators has 4 elements, A to D. So here, A, the company is required to have a public commitment to engage in social dialogue with appropriate parties for bipartite or tripartite negotiations, including workers, unions, or the equivalent, where the right to freedom of association and collective bargaining is restricted under law. And then B, the company should disclose the categories of stakeholders it engages with on a just transition and how they are identified. Again, this is including, at a minimum, workers, unions, or the equivalent, but is adding in affected stakeholders here. And then C, the company should disclose the steps it takes to engage with those identified stakeholders as part of its approach to supporting a just transition. Again, including, at a minimum, workers, unions, or the equivalent, and affected stakeholders. And then finally, D, the company should demonstrate social dialogue and meaningful engagement with stakeholders on all aspects of the just transition, again, including workers, unions, or the equivalent, and affected stakeholders. And the scoring for each of the indicators is the same because there are 4 elements. So the company must meet all 4 elements to score 2 points, 3 out of the 4 elements to score 1.5 points, 2 elements to score 1 point, and then finally 1 element to score 0 points, and no elements to score 0 points. And next indicator, please. So indicator 2 is the fundamentals of just transition planning. Again, this has 4 elements. So first, the company should demonstrate how it engages in both social dialogue, and that's including unions or the equivalent, and then also engage more broadly with stakeholders in the development of its just transition planning. And B, the company should have a set of time-bound measurable indicators to mitigate the social impacts of the low carbon transition on workers. And then C, again, the company should have a set of time-bound measurable indicators to mitigate the social impact of the low carbon transition on affected stakeholders, including here particularly vulnerable groups, and definitions. A definition of vulnerable groups can be found in the methodology. And then D, the company should have a set of time-bound measurable indicators to mitigate the social impacts of the transition on its business relationships. And the scoring, again, is the same. So 2 points is the maximum score. And then 4 elements, you should score 3 out of the 4 elements to score 1.5, 2 elements to score 1 point, 1 element to score 0.5 points, and no elements to score 0 points. Next indicator, please. So indicator 3 is fundamentals of creating and providing or supporting access to green and decent jobs for an inclusive and balanced workforce. So here, first, the company should have a public commitment to create and provide or support access to green and decent jobs as part of the transition. And then secondly, the company should disclose the assessment and disclose the results of that assessment, so the risks of employment dislocation caused by the transition and related impacts on workers and affected stakeholders. And C, the company should demonstrate the measures it takes, so the action that it takes to create and provide or support access to green and decent jobs for workers and other affected stakeholders. And then finally, the company should demonstrate how those measures that it takes to provide green and decent jobs embed gender balance and the inclusion of vulnerable groups. And the scoring is the same as the other previous indicators. Indicator 4, please. So indicator 4 is fundamentals of retaining and or upskilling workers for an inclusive, balanced workforce. And at this one first, again, the company should have a public commitment to or upskilling workers displaced by the transition. B, the company should disclose its process or processes for identifying skills gaps for workers and affected stakeholders in the context of the low carbon transition. And again, this should include at a minimum unions or the equivalent and communities. And C, the company should demonstrate the measures it takes to provide or upskilling, training or education opportunities for workers and affected stakeholders. And then D, the company should demonstrate how the measures it takes embed equality of opportunity for women and vulnerable groups. Next indicator, please. So indicator 5 is fundamentals of social protection and social impact management for a just transition. And here, the first indicator element A, the company should disclose its contribution to existing social protection systems. So this is primarily government, national social protection systems for workers and affected stakeholders. And it must also disclose that it expects its business relationships to contribute to social protection of workers and affected stakeholders. And in brackets here, you'll note that the company must also meet Core Social Indicator 16 on responsible tax fundamentals. And element B, the company should disclose its processes for identifying the impacts of the transition on workers and affected stakeholders' social protection. And then C, the company should demonstrate how it contributes to addressing the impact of the low carbon transition on workers' social protection in the context in which it operates. And then D, the company should do the same. So demonstrate how it contributes to addressing the impact of the transition on the social protection of affected stakeholders in the context in which it operates. And then we'll move to indicator 6, please. So the final indicator is fundamentals of advocacy for policies and regulation in green and decent job creation, employee retention, education and reskilling, and social protection supporting a just transition. So the company must first disclose its process for understanding the alignment of its lobbying activities with policies and regulation. B, the company should disclose where its lobbying activities do not align, so where there's misalignment between its lobbying activities with policies and regulation that support the just transition. And then C, the company should disclose its action plan to address the misalignment of its lobbying activities with policies and regulation that support the just transition. And D, finally, the company should demonstrate that it lobbies directly and or through trade associations and or employers' organisations for just transition policies that enable the generation of green and decent jobs, the retention, education and reskilling of workers, and or social protection of workers and affected stakeholders at the local or national or international level. So that's the 6 just transition indicators that we will be assessing companies against this year for the 2021 assessment.